Hello and welcome to Analyzing Finance with Nick. In this video I'm going to be doing one of my country breakdowns, but it's going to be a little bit different and a little bit retrospective. The first one of these videos I did was actually a reaction video to Kraut's commentary on the Greek debt crisis, and I kind of expanded upon that to summarize the economic future of Greece. Now I am going to do that with CaspianReport's video. Why China and Australia compete for supremacy, because Australia's economic future is the most geopolitically tied of any major country that I could think of, apart from maybe Taiwan. The future of Australia really is determinant on how it successfully realigns its relationships with China and the United States, and how whether it decides to prioritize short-term economic gain or long-term national security. This is the first of 3 Asia-Pacific videos I'm going to be doing. I'm going to do one on Australia, of course, right now, along with Singapore and Malaysia over the next couple weeks. And with that, let's get started with what CaspianReport has to say, because I think that he really does a good job and explain the geopolitical dilemma that Australia has. Australia has developed a prosperous society since it really was first settled, and they were able to have a really good run economically, basically from their last recession was in the early 1990s, I think about 1991, and from 1991 to 2020, Australia never had a recession and even continued to grow through the 2008 crisis, and their housing market never really had a real bust either, and it kept humming along through that whole time frame because of the rise of China. China's voracious demand for natural resources drove a boom in Australia, because Australia's key exports to the world are natural resources such as iron ore, coal, natural gas, gold, beef, other meat products, agriculture, oil, and copper, and other industrial metals too, such as aluminum. And exports are more, even to this day, with China's economy slowing down quite a bit, still more than 25% of GDP. And China needed these things in limited quantities to develop its cities and urbanize its population. In fact, like in the last 10 years, China used more concrete than the rest of the world combined. It just shows the magnitude of how this bid was able to propel Australia's economy for so long. And then there are other benefits that China provided, such as wealthy Chinese sending their children to Australian schools for education services, or Chinese buying real estate in Australia as a means to have second homes or to have a bug-out location if the politics of China went against their particular group of the elite. And so you could see a lot of intertwining with China has made Australia vulnerable. China's main export partner pre-COVID was China at 32.6% of total exports. Their closest Western export market is the United States, which is only 5.3%. Even New Zealand, who they have very close tie to, is only 3.4% of exports, given New Zealand has a tiny population compared to powers such as China, Japan, and Korea, and the US and India, who are the countries ahead of them. But it just shows how dependent they were, and I think that the biggest challenge, I think, for Australia is going to be how they realign in a post-China world.
Characterize Australian foreign policy. First, it will ally with the world's chief naval power to protect its maritime interests. Second, it will stay on the winning side of the global geopolitical struggle. Third, it will use the safety of isolation to engage in calculated and deliberate diplomacy.
Yeah, this is why I think they will side with the United States. The US is the dominant naval power. China is unable to project force more than 1,000 miles with its current navy. They have been building a lot of ships, but they're still nowhere at the level the U.S. is able to patrol the global seas. And their cultural affinity in terms of language and just shared social values in many ways makes an easy choice for Australia to align with the United States. And the U.S. is still wanting the global order. A lot of people like to say that's not the case, but look at the strength of the U.S. dollar right now and how well America has fared through the most recent global crises than it has compared to, say, Europe or East Asia. So let's continue.
Since 1942, these principles have ensured Australian-US alignment, but the relationship is asymmetrical. Canberra needs Washington more than Washington needs it. As such, Australian policymakers promote their country's strategic weight by offering the United States a staging ground for Asia-Pacific policymaking.
That is true. Without the U.S. protecting the global sea lanes, Australia can't export its goods. And also, they need the assistance of the U.S. military to ensure Australian business interests throughout the South Pacific. And so that's why I think that even though people say, oh, why does Australia need America's help? They're on the opposite side of the world. And couldn't China provide the export markets? Yeah, but China may not be as benevolent. China also would probably want a disproportionate amount of Chinese to be able to move into Australia. Australia is about is more bigger than half of the landmass of mainland China, where it has only 25 million people, whereas China in its eastern half, which is 94% of its population, has over 1.2 trillion people. The cramped space is partially why birth rates are declining in China. And in the Chinese world, China would love to export its population to places with temperate climate and natural resource abundance and close by geographically. And Australia would be a good place to do that, which is why Australia is at a risk of potential military conflict with China, because they have the land and the resources that China wants, and China has the manpower. The protection of the United States is what ensures that some sort of kinetic tension between those two countries doesn't happen.
The AUKUS Pact, signed in 2021, will expand interoperability further, providing Australia with nuclear submarines, cyber capabilities, and hypersonic missiles. Washington thus assumes responsibility for Australia's defense. But the price Canberra must pay in return is to subordinate itself to American grand strategy.
That's why Australia is going to be willing to be hawkish on trade with China and being cut off from imports from China, because as you've seen with the recent geopolitical conflict in the world, security means a lot more than economic growth. If you don't have the assurance that your country will be in its current state and maintain its independent sovereignty, then you can't really invest in the country. You can't really expect living standards to develop or enough social stability to be there that is needed for a prosperous society. And yeah, they're definitely going to take some lumps in the process. As I said, like up to 8% of Australia's GDP is dependent on exports to China, and there might be more dependent on services sold to Chinese nationals. And that is going to inevitably come down if U.S.-China tensions remain tense and Australia picks the side of the United States. But yeah, it's a short-term pain for a long-term stability.
Cultural affinity makes Australia's junior partner status easier to swallow. But while leaders sing the tune of shared Western values, the alliance's underlying base note is cold realism. This is why Australia takes a confrontational stance towards China. Some argue that Canberra's policy undermines Australia's economic interests since China is its largest trading partner. But this too misunderstands how Canberra perceives its economic interests.
Yeah, I just elaborated on all this, and he kind of just sums it up right there. You can see Australia's shipping lanes are very interconnected to East Asia, but it also makes it vulnerable to Chinese hegemony if they didn't have the protection of the United States. And they still can trade with ASEAN and Japan, so it's not like Asian trade is going to be completely gone, and even Chinese trade won't go to zero. It just won't be the primary growth driver for the economy like it was the 1990s, the 2000s, and the 2010s.
Firstly, much of Australia's China-bound trade consists of minerals, which account for 2/3 of export income. This demand is generated by China's construction industry, especially iron ore, a crucial component in steel.
Yeah, and the other thing is that 2/3 of their exports are minerals. Minerals are very volatile in price like any other industrial commodity. And so by having some sort of relative divestiture here, Australia's economy may in the long run be less volatile and less sensitive to the demands for iron ore in China. And then with China's current real estate crisis that's going on and its loads of excess supply of property and the population not growing fast enough to cover a lot of these things. Like I've seen stories out there saying that they have more empty housing units than the entire population of Germany or the UK, and China's birth rate continues to plummet, then that demand might not even be there anyway. So this is kind of like Brexit in the sense that Brexit risked a lot of short-term pain, but it could if handled right, and I'm not really sure how well the British government has handled that transition. If you want to know more about that, just watch my video on the economic future of the UK. But it is maybe a good thing to cut the ties or reduce the ties to an economy that may be at risk of being a sinking ship, where the EU in the case of the UK and Brexit, or China possibly, and maybe China's not going to go away and disappear, but its slower growth or stagnation outright that's possible means that depending on its demand for raw materials for construction is a loser's bet.
On an annual base, Australia produces 900 million tons of iron ore, more than double that of second-placed Brazil. And since there are no significant alternative suppliers, Australian mining companies are convinced that Chinese demand will persist in the face of geopolitical tensions. Secondly, Canberra's perception of its economic interests is shaped by lobbying.
The other nice thing about commodities markets too is you can always do workarounds. Like Australia could just ship its iron ore elsewhere, and the countries that have better relations with China, such as Brazil, can ship their iron ore to China, and Australia can cover the rest of the world's demand. Again, that's possible too, but I think the overall demand for iron ore is not going to be strong for the foreseeable future anyway.
Lobbying. Given China's economic weight, one would assume businesses would push for good relations with Beijing. But as of 2019, 15 of the top 20 companies listed on the Australian Securities Exchange were majority American-owned, including...
This is another interesting statistic I didn't realize until I watched CaspianReport's video, and that is how much American ownership there is in Australian companies, particularly the mining firms. A lot is through ETFs and mutual funds companies such as BlackRock and State Street, and that's how investors indirectly invest through them. But it's still enough that Australia needs to act in the best interest of its America because its investors are largely American. And its financial markets, a lot of Australians own stocks in the US stock market, and a lot of Americans own Australian equities. And it's kind of a mutually beneficial arrangement here. And so, yeah, this is, I guess, another reason why you haven't really seen much pushback, even though you'd think on a superficial level, hey, wait, maybe Australia would be better off siding with China. But defense needs, cultural proclivities, and inter-investment between both countries definitely points more to sticking with America here.
Including 4 of the 5 mining companies. The holders of equity determine corporate policy and priorities. Thus, in practice, lobbying fuses together Australian and American economic interests. Canberra's role within Washington's security umbrella has led its neighbors to label it America's deputy sheriff or lapdog. Yet, this is only half the equation, and while the American alliance helps ensure Australia's survival is not at all it is interested in. Since the 19th century, Australia's maritime alliances have granted a free hand in the Pacific, from the cotton crops of Fiji to the phosphate mines of Nauru to the gold and copper pits of New Guinea. The Pacific region is a profitable destination for Australian businesses, and since Canberra relies on its companies to obtain tax revenue, it is duty-bound to ensure a stable investment climate.
Yeah, the Pacific market is critical to Australia. Australia is a big investor, and Australians are big investors in the natural resource extraction industries, tourism industries, that are prominent among many of those islands. And they also, Australian manufactured goods are sold to, and to those professional services are sold to those countries that cannot produce them on their own. So they are a valuable end market, and the only way they can ensure that access as the primary vendor to those markets is if the U.S. again protects the sea lanes. The rest of this video goes more into security and geopolitical issues that are not as related to the economic future of Australia. And with that, we're going to get to everybody's favorite part, the U.S. state comparison section. Like I do typically with these videos, I compare the country I'm talking about to a region in the United States of America to help provide context to my mostly American viewers of this channel. However, since Australia is so big, in fact, really its landmass is almost as big as the entire continental United States, I'm not going to compare it to just a single state, but an entire region of similar population and character. And the region I'm going to be comparing it to is the Mountain West, which is basically the states between the Pacific coast and the 100th meridian, which is kind of where the rainy climates of the east meet with the drier climates of the west. As is known in American culture, where the Mountain West Conference of college sports is dominant. These include the states of Arizona, Utah, Wyoming, Idaho, Colorado, New Mexico, Nevada, and Montana. And Hawaii and Alaska I'm going to include in this too. Even though I didn't include Nevada in the picture here, there's plenty of space here to fit it in Western Australia near Perth. Surprisingly, these states combined have a very similar population. Australia is about twice the size in terms of land area, with Australia being a little less than 3 million square miles, whereas the Mountain West is slightly over 1.5 million square miles. But population-wise, Australia has 26 million people versus 25 million people in the Mountain West. And the largest portion of both these regions, Alaska, in the case of the Mountain West, and the Outback, when it comes to Australia, have only about 700,000 people each. In fact, the Outback is much bigger than Alaska. It's up to 2/3 of Australia, depending on how you define the Outback. Yet it only has 700,000 people, and Alaska is equally remote. And similar, the other thing in terms of the population is that it's heavily concentrated in a few key metropolitan areas. Denver and Phoenix are the biggest ones in the United States, whereas the biggest in Australia are Sydney and Melbourne. Other major cities would probably be next would be Brisbane and Las Vegas for Australia and the US respectively. But outside of these core metropolitan areas, the population is very sparse in both places. Both places have a high percentage of native or aboriginal populations, with Australia being 3.2% of aboriginal descent and the Mountain West region being 3.1% of Native American descent of all different tribes. They are also very natural resource heavy, with the Mountain West being a leading exporter and producer of agriculture to a certain degree, but more mining, such as copper in Arizona. They have rare earth minerals, but they haven't been mined yet. They have a lot of oil in the region, particularly in Colorado and New Mexico, and several other types of minerals. Nevada, particularly, was known historically for silver. And Australia is known for a lot of minerals. It is a leading exporter of iron ore to Asia. It also has oil, natural gas, big amount of farming and ranching, and a variety of other industrial metals and minerals that are valuable to the global economy. However, in terms of tax revenue that comes from natural resource rents, it's much different. Australia collects 10% of its GDP from natural resource rents, whereas Mountain West federal land is not as heavily taxing on natural resource extraction, and a lot of it's in private hands. So even though both regions have a significant portion of their economy come from natural resources, I couldn't really find it for every state in the Mountain West region on the aggregate. But for Colorado, which is the one I know the best when it comes to this, about 6.2% of their economy comes from natural resource and energy extraction. Still quite a bit less, but the mountain rents is again very low. It's about 1%, and the whole region is less than 1%. So the way that where the profits from natural resources goes varies differently, even though both of the regions rely heavily on natural resources. So that's my thoughts on the economic future of Australia. When it comes to Australia, my view is that I think they're going to have a lot of short-term pain due to having to have a forced readjustment of their economy to realign their trade networks with their security partners versus their biggest economic partner. China is what allowed Australia not to have a recession for 30 plus years, from the early 90s to the pandemic. But now, in a world where China is a security threat and they rely on the US to protect their trade routes and to preserve their culture in Australia, they're making the hard choice to sacrifice the short-term economic growth in favor of longer-term geopolitical and social stability. They are in the process of taking that hit, and it's going to be a challenge. But once they make it out of it, I think Australia will continue to be as strong as ever. Australia is one of the better performing economies in the world during the Cold War and before trade was open to China, and China was as voracious of the consumer as it was in the 90s and 2000s. And I think Australia can continue to do well in the long run with less demand from China, whether it's demand for raw material exports or from education services and real estate bought by Chinese elites moving their descendants to Australia, whether for studying or relocation. A lot of that is, again, being realigned for geopolitical purposes, and it will be tough, but I think in the long run, Australia is in pretty good shape. They have plenty of natural resources and space for their existing population. They have a well-educated population, and they have allies who are willing to protect their trade lanes so that they can still be connected to the world, and they still remain a power in their own right regionally. Let me know what your thoughts are. Feel free to comment, and if you have any questions or feedback, like and share. And also, if you have any recommended off the beaten path places to visit in Australia, let me know, and I'll keep it in mind every time I decide to go there in the future. Thanks for watching.